So welcome everyone to the second webinar of the series, Managing the Uncontrollable. This one, of course, is focused on water. As always, people like to trickle into the meeting for the next few minutes. So what we have done for your enjoyment, of course, is we've set up a poll. So we're going to get Danielle to put up the poll. So while you wait, should I be doing a drum roll here? There we go. We've got some poll questions for everyone to answer while we wait for everybody to come in here. All right, well, it's 4:05 on my time, so it must be 4:07 for you, Daniel. We'll get this started here. So if people are still coming in, feel free to hit the poll. We'll probably shut down the poll here in a couple minutes. I just want to welcome everyone to this. So my name is Lindsay Hainstock. I work with Extension in British Columbia up in Canada, and we're kind of new. We've been newly invited to this group. So of course, as newbies, you always get thrown the job. You got to step up and do something. So I get to be the host tonight with Bernardita. So tonight's topic is water. Not sure if the poll is still showing up. I know it's on my screen here. So we were asking people just to sign in with the poll. I see we've got about 38 participants in right now. We've got about 18 people answering in the polls. So we'll let that run for just a little minute longer then, do you guys? Or do you want to shut her down and let's get going?
Maybe we can keep it open during the introduction, Lindsay.
Perfect. Excellent. So if we'll just keep moving then here. So while you guys are answering the poll questions, we're going to introduce the wonderful people that got strong-armed into being here today.
Actually, one moment.
Oh, no. Okay. We can't advance
sorry.
it. Otherwise, they'll lose the poll.
No.
Oh, okay.
I just advanced it here. For those of you who attended last week, or I should say didn't attend last week and wish to watch the previous meetup that we have, there is a recording that is currently available on Penn State's Kaltura. The only reason it's there first is because that's where I work. It'll start showing up in other places, YouTube, probably Washington and Michigan state universities. It'll show up there as well. But if you're interested in watching it, that's the link to get to it, or you can use the QR code on your screen. You shouldn't have any problems accessing it, and there's a built-in player in the browser window when you connect. So if you're interested in that, there it is, and we'll take you back to your regularly scheduled program now.
Thanks. All right, so this is a great group of people that have put this together, and want to thank it's definitely been a collaborative effort with these meetings and really interesting to be a part of. This is a brainchild of a few of these people. I think, was it originally Bernardita, Mario, Danielle, Emily that was working with this group, and the concept of how to better connect all of us across North America here. We're all tree fruit growers working in the industry and dealing with a lot of the similar issues. And so the series started, I believe, with a Honeycrisp focus. Then last year was the labor focus. And this year, of course, climate is another issue that none of us seem to be able to escape right now. So wanted to thank Christy Gregg McGruffin. She wished she was here tonight, but unfortunately, kids decided to bring something home from school with a virus. We've got, of course, Bernardita Sallato from Washington State, Mario Miranda, and I'm going to brutalize names. Oh my goodness, I should have practiced this. Sazo from Cornell University. Caitlin Hengel couldn't be here tonight. She's my colleague up here in British Columbia. Emily Lavallee from Michigan State, and Daniel Weber from Penn State Extension. And of course, so just to give you an idea of what we'll be doing tonight, as you experienced, we had the audience poll at the beginning, gives us a good idea of the demographics we're speaking to, and helps hopefully direct our conversations later on as to what people are interested to hear about. We also have a great group of panelists. We've drawn on growers from the many different regions who've also had different experiences with water as their issue and can speak to that. And then always, our speakers, we got really lucky, I think, tonight as well. They complement each other well, and I will get into a more detailed instructions on that, or details on that. And then so there'll be the main presentations by our speakers, and then it's going to open up. We're going to have our panels as part of a discussion, but the panelists are there to help lead the discussion. So the idea of this is certainly for everyone to be involved. That for anyone tuning in from anywhere, if you have something you wish to ask of the speakers, ask of the panelists, just be part of the discussion. Please don't be shy to jump in. We have the chat that you can put your questions into. If you're a little shy speaking up on your own, we can bring it to the broader group. I do notice that conversations do tend to happen in the chat sometimes and go off as a side note to the conversation happening in the meeting. I would like to encourage people, though, to bring the conversation to the full discussion so that everybody can participate in it. It's not distracting from the conversation happening. So, and then with that, we'll wrap up, of course, discussing what is the next event, where you can find the information if you wanted to review any of this later on. So with that, let's get on to the panelists. So we have Steve Brown. He's one of the growers I've had the pleasure of working with for many years up here in British Columbia, an apple grower, and has dabbled in cherries as well. We have Randy Hart from New York. Oh, good. I love this. The people waving. Is he visible on here right now? Apple farms in New York State. We've got Tom Ferri of TK Ferri Orchards from Ontario. Garret Henry of Douglas Fruit, Washington. You can see Gary's kind of a gray blank right now, so I'm sure he's waving at us. Steve Frecon from Frecon Farms in Boyerton, USA. And we got Kyle, and I'm supposed to say this with a German accent, Rasch from Tom Rasch and Sons Orchards in Michigan. And here's our wonderful speakers. So tonight we're going to have Dr. Alan Lakso, speak first. Dr. Lakso, I'm guessing, is probably well known to many people here. He's certainly served the apple industry for many years well. The main focus we've asked him to speak on tonight is apple-water relations and new technologies to monitor water stress. He, of course, where's my information here, is an Emeritus Professor of Horticulture from Cornell University. And then our second speaker is Dr. Kirsten Hannam, who I get the pleasure of working with up here in British Columbia. So Kirsten's focus is she's an agro-ecologist working for our federal research station, and she examines water, carbon, and nutrient dynamics within the agro-ecosystems at a range of spatial scales. So we'll have Alan talk about it on the tree level in the orchard, and then Kirsten can take us out to a broader perspective of this. So with that, we're going to quickly head back to the poll results. I believe, is that what we're going to, evaluate us. Did you want me to speak to that first, Daniel?
The results should be shared. I don't know if other people are having problems seeing it, but I have it up as being shared at the moment.
Is everybody seeing the poll results right now, or is it maybe just me not seeing them?
I'm getting thumbs up, so.
All right, Bernardita, can you see them? Do you want to lead on the poll stuff right now then, if you can see it?
Yes, I can see them now. So the question that we posted for all of you as we get started was, the first one was, what is your primary rainwater related issues? And we see here that 60% indicated that rain has become too unpredictable and unreliable. And 30% indicated the lack of rain and depending on irrigation was the second biggest issue in relation to rainwater. The second question that we posted, do you have easy access to water for irrigation? And 40% indicates that yes, personal well or streams for natural or constructed. We also have 25% indicated yes, public utility systems, 20% yes, personal wells, and then 15%, only 15% said no. The third question we have here, have you experienced significant drought in your areas? And we have 45% indicated yes in the last 5 years, 20% yes in the last 10 years, and another 25% yes almost every year, and only 5% indicated no. And another 5% indicated no, but is concerned that it might be coming. The fourth question we have here, if you irrigate, do you? And we have several options here. These are long ones, so I'm not so sure I want to read all of them, but I will mention the ones that are 90% or highly selected. Those that irrigate, they use localized irrigation methods or micro irrigation, drip irrigation, micro sprinklers, subsurface irrigation, and perforated and porous tubbing. So it seems that everyone uses one of these other irrigation systems. What tools do you use to guide the irrigation decisions? We have 75% that use weather station, online tools like NIWA, etc. So I would mention their AgWeatherNet in Washington. Another 65% use soil moisture tools, instruments such as individual probes, tensiometers, gypsum blocks, or internet-connected probes, data loggers, and automated irrigation systems.
Good.
And a lower degree, 15% use tree water status monitoring. That would be a good conversation with Alan Lakso to talk about that. And then 5% an irrigation consultant that makes those decisions. We will be sharing the results of this poll later on when we share the videos in our different extension venues for those of you that haven't heard or it wasn't clear enough.
Thank you. So that certainly gives us an idea that there's a lot of people interested in irrigation as a component of the water issues that they're dealing with and how to monitor for these things. So that will help us guide this discussion. Whoops, I'm gonna close it. Now the poll shows up on my screen. So without further ado then, I guess we'll move along here. I would love to turn the floor over to Dr. Alan Lakso to start the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, I'll go ahead and share my screen if I can remember which which screen to use here. I think this. Okay, can everybody see the
Yes.
screen? Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. This is a real pleasure and honor to speak with you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the growers. I learn a lot from talking to the growers. So, yeah, I'd like to just cover a few points. Obviously, there's a big topic for the amount of time we have, but a few points about soil, weather, and tree physiology and how they interact to affect the actual water status of the tree that's so critical that we're trying to control. So I look at the system as like economics, supply and demand. And if the supply is short of the demand, then you end up with stress. And so we are interested, obviously, in the supply in terms of the soil, and then also the rain or irrigation input. And of course, the demand is driven a lot by the weather, but is also modified by the tree physiology and the structure of the orchards that we're growing. And so first, I would want to take a look, just a reminder, I think everyone knows the importance of the soil water holding capacity. And it does make a big difference. So we just have a table just showing different types of soil, from the ones with very high water holding capacity like clay or silty loam, down to a very coarse sand or gravelly type of soil. And I just put this up just to show that a range of amount of water that they actually can hold. So just assuming 24 inches of soil for the rooting zone of our plants, with a clay or silt loam, something like that, you can have about 163,000 gallons, or around 160,000 gallons of water per acre, and that's about 6 acre inches. And then it can be as low with the gravels and sands as maybe only 20,000 gallons, or 3/4 of an acre inch. Now, for us in New York, where we generally find a mature orchard with the typical spacing here, with our weather conditions, we'll expect to use, maybe on an average through the main part of the summer, around an acre inch a week, maybe a little bit more, 1.25 acre inches a week in the middle of summer when we don't have any rain. So the difference in the sand versus a silt loam, for example, can be rather huge in terms of the amount of time before you run out of water. And so it's your bank account. And I just wanted to emphasize it. In one case, it can be as little as days, 4 to 6 days. And with another soil, heavier soil, it could be several weeks, month or more. And of course, this means that you may need to be obviously irrigating more with a lighter soil. It can also, on the flip side, though, if you'd like to have a little bit of stress to slow down tree growth, then it's very difficult to do that when you have a very heavy silty loam that absorbs a tremendous amount of water, and it's a lot harder to get rid of water than it is to add water. So there's just some numbers, but I'm sure this group is well aware of the role of the soil, so won't really dwell on that too much. We can obviously come back to it later. But in terms of the tree water use, the demand side, we're looking primarily at 2 aspects of the weather, and that is the solar radiation, how much you have, and clearly across the range of climates that we're dealing with here in this group, there's some pretty big ranges in the amount of solar radiation. And it is what actually provides the energy to drive the evaporation of water. So it's a really key factor. It's the key factor that drives the ETO calculations that you typically see from Penman-Monteith equations that are calculated by the weather networks, for example. But a lot of it then is dependent on not only the amount of radiation available, but how much of it that's actually intercepted by the trees. So if you have very wide spacings, then you may not intercept nearly as much. The whole orchard will intercept it, but generally we're not irrigating the entire orchard. We're generally irrigating just the trees. So we don't necessarily have to worry about replacing the water throughout the entire surface area. But the other weather component is the evaporative demand, or how dry the air is, or the VPD, vapor pressure deficit. And that can vary quite dramatically. I did some calculations, and the average in the middle of summer for Wenatchee, Washington is about 80% higher on the evaporative demand than it is in Finger Lakes in New York, for example. So there's some big differences there. So the combination of the radiation and the evaporative demand generally drives for similar orchards in New York, 1.25 acre inches a week, or in Washington, about twice that. So those are some of the key components about the demand. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the physiology of the tree involved too. Now, one thing that we realize with trees versus, say, a grass or cover crops or vegetables, those low crops, is that there's really 2 components that lead to the water status of the crop. And that is the soil moisture which is obviously one of the limitations. And in this plot, we're showing the tree water use or water loss rates. And it goes from when you have cool, humid, overcast kind of conditions up to the hot, dry, sunny conditions. You have a big gradient for water loss rates there. And the water status on this plot, it's negative. This is there's a unit megapascals, which you don't need to worry about, but this is the lower it goes is the more stress. So it's a deficit. That's why it's expressed as negative. So we really have two components to what happens to the water status of a tree at any particular time. And that is the soil is obviously the limit, because you can't have better water status than the soil is providing. So if you have very good water status in the soil, no deficit at all in the soil, you still will see the water status get drier and drier, a little more stress as you go through the day. If it gets from morning that cool and humid up to hot, dry afternoon, the water status will go lower and lower, and then it will come back in the evening and night. So even with well-watered soil, you still have a cycle of drought stress or water stress during the day. And I'll show that pattern in just a minute. So of course, that soil can provide a limit also. And so at this end, you have really almost no water loss from the tree. So if the soil dries out, the tree is also going to be stressed more. So the soil has a component of stress, and then the weather induces a component of stress. And the tree can limit that water loss by closing the pores in the leaves. But the two weather components are the weather and the soil are really both involved. And so neither one of them actually controls the entire water status of the crop. Okay. Now, so this pattern goes on through the day. So you get the cycling every day. And so at night or pre-dawn, right around sunup, is when the trees are generally not losing very much water, maybe almost zero. That could actually be a bit in drier climates, but basically this least stress, the highest value, is when the tree is equilibrating with the soil, and it's a soil around the roots. And so it's the effective soil moisture that the tree is sensing will be this highest value. And then during the day, as the sun comes up and you get more evaporative stress, then the water status declines and then reaches a maximum amount of stress in the mid-afternoon or so. And then it recovers as you get into the night back up to a new level. And so I just connected these maximum values to indicate what the soil moisture stresses are. And you can see as it went down, then at irrigation, the soil moisture came up and stayed up for a while, and then gradually went down and then got irrigated again. So that's the pattern of the soil. And then the lowest point in each day is when you get your maximum stress due to the weather. And so this is the type of pattern that our trees go through as you go from day to day. So it's not a uniform type of pattern. We're still trying to understand exactly what are the key periods in terms of things like the function of the leaves, the growth of the fruit, growth of shoots. So now we're beginning to get a better idea of what these patterns are. So hopefully we'll be getting a better understanding of the diurnal changes and things. So just a few comments on some other factors that affect drought response. The crop load can be important. Trees with a heavy crop use more water. the tree, fruit is demanding more photosynthesis from the leaves, and the leaves are staying with their pores open more, and so that they can take in the CO2 to support the growth of that large crop, and so they'll actually be using more water, and so they will tend to use water faster than the light cropping trees. So that may shorten the period between times that you get into the stress at which you might want to irrigate. The other thing is that heavy crops have a very strong effect on reducing the growth of the root system. And plants and apples usually try, when they start having some drought stress, they try to grow more roots to go get more water to try to overcome that. But when you have a very heavy crop, there's very little root growth that can occur. Of course, this is why we don't crop up trees immediately when we put them in the orchard, because you can really stunt the root system. But the crop level and the high crop will definitely be an issue for water status. Also, higher nitrogen nutrition will lead to, in many cases, somewhat bigger leaves and maybe higher photosynthesis rates a little bit. Those pores will be open more. You'll have more leaf area, and can lead to more water use. And lower or more moderate nitrogen levels, can restrict the water use a bit. Of course, we don't want to make them deficient to save water because there are too many other problems with that. We have done some work that summer pruning can reduce water use somewhat. And by reducing that water use, it relieves some of that weather-related water stress that develops. Now, that's not it's not a huge effect. I mean, it's something that can help, but it is one possible type of way to adjust the cropping a bit, or the stress level on the crop. Okay. Really, what exactly is the goal of irrigation or these other management practices? We don't really tend to think about it in that sense, but really the goal is to maintain an optimum water status of the trees that will give us the desired amount of shoot growth and tree growth to develop a canopy that we want, and keep the leaves functional so that you can ripen a crop, and support the development of the fruit. Now, generally, we know that if you're going to have some water stress, you don't necessarily want to have it during cell division of the fruit growth. We've done a lot of work on fruit growth, and if you lose cell numbers in that first few weeks after bloom, you're going to pay for it for the rest of the season. You can't really blow up an apple with very few fruit cells in it. That those large fruits have to have large numbers of cells. So that first cell division is a very, very critical time that you don't really want to have a lot of water stress. Now, somewhat later, when you're getting after cell division, expansion is a little more flexible in terms of you can have some stress and they still are able to grow. A little bit too much stress, if it's relieved, there can be a little recovery of growth. So you definitely want to avoid cell division drought stress. Okay. So I guess the question then comes up, well, how do you know when and how much to do? When do you start irrigation? How much, what, and another question sometimes we don't tend to think about so much is, how do you really know if you've actually achieved your goal? Did you get the water status that you really want? And that's one thing that we've been thinking about. And so it basically gets down to guess or measure. And so we'll talk about some measurements. I know from the poll, a lot of you are using soil moistures and other methods. That's great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your experience with it. And so I'll just make a few comments about some of the methods, and then we'll have a chance to have Kirsten talk about those on a broader scale. Then, in terms of measuring water stress in a tree, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different factors involved. You have factors such as the weather patterns, but then the pruning and training involved fertilization, the stage of development, amount of leaf area, crop level. The plant is just integrating a tremendous number of different things, and I have a whole list down the other side there. And so we're trying to figure out, do you measure all these different things and then try to estimate what's going on in the tree? Or the other approach is to actually just measure it in the tree. When you go to see the doctor and they're interested in your blood pressure, they don't measure how much salt you have in your diet, or a lot of different indirect things. They try to just measure your blood pressure directly. So that actually over the years led me to not do so much on measuring all those other blue arrows, as much as just saying, well, let the tree integrate it, because we don't always know what how all these factors are integrating yet. So, so a few comments, some of the pros and cons on some of these different measurement methods. Soil moisture, it's an obvious one. That soil is where the supply is. So it's important to be able to measure that available water supply, what it is, how it's changed over time. So we have an estimate of how it's likely to change in the next period. And also to add up so that we got a volume amount that we want to be able to irrigate with, to either refill it, or if we're using some deficit irrigation, to replace a portion of that. So we need to know that. But some of the cons or limitations of that is that in many cases, we'll use one soil moisture probe, or maybe several, but in one location. And in most cases, a soil moisture probe really only senses a small amount, maybe a liter of soil around the sensor itself. And that really is a quite tiny portion of the soil. So if you had a liter that's being sensed, and you're sensing under a tree that has say a cubic meter or cubic yard of soil in the root system, that's only like 0.1%. So it's a very tiny sample. So it's very important that we get the sensor right by the roots. The problem with apple roots is that we tend to have a big root system, but it's not very intense. So, for example, compared to grass that might be growing in the row, the grass can have 100 to 500 times the length of root per unit volume than the apple tree does. So we tend to have big systems, but they're sparse, and they tend to be kind of erratic in their location. They're not extremely consistent. So in this diagram of root distributions, this is in a non-irrigated orchard, and they can see that the root distributions are not very consistent. So trying to place a soil moisture probe sometimes gets to be kind of a shot in the dark, because we really can't see where we're putting it in terms of the root numbers. Now in arid zones, there tends to be more concentration of roots under the drippers, because the other sections of soil don't really get that much moisture. And so that makes it a little bit easier to be able to try to estimate where the roots are. But in many cases, in more humid zones, we don't get that concentration, and so we're a little more at the mercy of this erratic nature of the root distributions. So, so then on the demand side, the weather-based models, they can estimate the demand for water based on the weather, but it assumes that there's no water stress, then you have perfectly healthy trees. So if you have some stress, then that weather-based model is going to say what it could be, but not necessarily what the trees actually are doing at that point. Also, we found that it's less accurate in variable humid climates, like in New York, because the ETO is driven almost exclusively by radiation. It doesn't take into account humidity and the vapor pressure gradient nearly as much as fruit trees in our area actually respond to. So we had to develop an apple-specific ET model, which we have on the NUA system. Now, the other approach, as mentioned, is just measure the tree. And so, of course, we do that in various ways. There's observation, which is just looking at the tree. It's very rough, but that plus a lot of experience can be quite useful getting us into the ballpark. But in terms of more specific direct measurements, there are what we refer to as dendrometers, where we measure the diameter of the trunk or the fruit. They shrink during the day as the water's being taken out of the tree, and then they expand at night as they rehydrate. And those patterns relate to the water stress of the tree, although there's some difficulties in interpreting those results. There's another one that you may have heard of, sap flow, that sensors are put in the trunk to try to measure the velocity of water going through the trunk and estimating then the total water use by the tree by trying to measure that flow through the trunk. And then there's the direct measurements of the stress itself using the pressure chamber, or commonly called the pressure bomb method, or we have a new sensor called the microtensiometer. And I'll just show quickly. In this case, this is the pressure chamber. Take a leaf off and have to put it in a chamber and pressurize it. And but it gives you a spot reading, an instantaneous snapshot of the water status of the plant at that moment that you took the leaf off. And for growers, that use it, it's common to maybe get one measurement a week at a given point. So on this plot of the water stress over time, this red dot would be what you'd get with the pressure bomb. But what you like to see is the actual pattern that's continuously going on, where we can learn a lot more about the stress. And also, if you put on an irrigation, it will tell you whether or not you actually reach the stress level that you're wanting. So it helps dial in the irrigation somewhat better. So this is just it's actually a tensiometer, just like a soil tensiometer, same principle, but it's a microchip that has a tiny amount of water in it, and it's we drill a hole and it's plugged into the tree or grapevine, whatever plant we're using it with, and it equilibrates with the plant. And so when the plant dries out, it pulls water out of the sensor. And when it rehydrates, water goes back into the sensor, and that can be measured. So this is a technique that we developed at Cornell, and we have a small company, Flora Pulse, that's making it available now for growers. So I think I'd better stop at this point and let Kirsten go on. But if you have questions beyond this, my initials ANL2, at cornell.edu. If you have questions, we'd be happy to help you out. So,
Oh, we're
okay.
not letting you off that easy. So we'll bring Dr. Kirsten Hannam on here next to speak, but what we will do is we'll then move to the panelists and open the floor up for questions as well to the speakers and the panelists. So yeah, don't think you're getting away yet, Ellen.
Oh, well, thanks, that's it.
Awesome. Over to Kristen. Or sorry, Kirsten. You're muted, Kirsten.
You would think after this many months and years, I wouldn't make that mistake anymore. Can everyone hear me okay now? Awesome, thank you. So what I was saying is, thanks Lindsay for the introduction, and Alan as well for a wonderful overview of some of the principles that I'll be talking a little bit about today. The description of some of the controlling factors, such as weather, tree physiology, and soil properties in determining water supply and demand, and its effect on tree function is a perfect introduction for me. So thank you, Alan. Okay. All right, so I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of an overview of the Okanagan Valley, because I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the principles Alan presented in the context of the Okanagan Valley, where here we absolutely rely on irrigation for agriculture. So for those few of you who might not know, the Okanagan Valley is located right along the border with Washington in southern British Columbia. We're in the rain shadow of the coast and Cascade Mountains, and as a result, we have a very dry, semi-arid climate. We get about 325 millimeters of rain on average per year, which is about, I think, 12 or 13 inches. And we also tend to have very coarse textured soils, which, as you know from Alan, means that these soils don't have a great capacity for holding on to the water. So as a result, we need to irrigate these soils because of the dry climate, and we need to irrigate the soils quite frequently because of the often coarse textures that we're growing crops in. Because we get so little rain in the Okanagan Valley, our water supply, it depends a lot on snowpack that accumulates in the mountains above us over the winter. And then we've built a whole series of dams and reservoirs to retain the meltwater so that we can hold it back and release it slowly through the growing season. And access to irrigation water can be granted from the government to water users through individual licenses to use surface or groundwater. But in the Okanagan, unlike many of the respondents to the survey, the vast majority of irrigators get their water from a purveyor, municipality, or some other agency that controls the access of the water held in dams or reservoirs, and the pipes that control the flow of that water. So there are some great benefits to getting your water from a water purveyor in the Okanagan. There are about 53 water purveyors here in the valley, fewer than there were before. They were originally often set up specifically to support agricultural irrigation, but with time, these water purveyors are being absorbed into the local municipalities, who also control access to water for domestic use and industrial use. But the great thing about getting your water or establishing water purveyance system or getting your water from a purveyed source is that the cost of setting up the system is shared, maintenance costs are shared, and there are other community benefits in terms of using the water for recreation or firefighting, which is increasingly important here in the valley. Because licenses granted to water purveyors are so huge, the effects of drought on individual irrigators can be buffered a little bit. But that being said, access to water is a huge growing issue here in the Okanagan Valley. We had a few years where flooding was a big issue, but overall droughts are a much greater concern for growers here. The graph that you see on this slide in yellow is taken from a climate station that was set up a long time ago here at the Summerland Research and Development Center where I work. And you can see that there is a trend toward increasing number of days greater than 35 degrees Celsius from 1916 when data were first being collected up until now. And then you see the figure at the bottom of this graph in green relates our estimates of evapotranspiration, which you know from Alan's talk is the loss of water from the soil surface and from leaves, and relating that to the air temperature. And you can see that as air temperature increases, so does our estimate of evapotranspiration. So if we're irrigating to replace the water that was lost from the orchard, we're needing to use more water as temperatures increase. So if we come back to what that means for those many growers who get their water from purveyed systems, the effect of warming temperatures on access to water is becoming a pretty big issue. The figure on the bottom left that you see in this slide was provided by my colleague Denise Nielsen, and that figure relates the number of days above an estimated peak evapotranspiration that was used to develop the irrigation systems for the Summerland irrigation area. 6.75 millimeters per day was the estimated design standard for peak evapotranspiration when the system was set up several decades ago. But as time goes on and our climate is warming, that system is becoming overwhelmed. And as a result, there are going to need to be pretty costly maintenance and upgrades to our purveyance systems that are going to need to be shouldered by the larger taxpayers because the cost that water users pay doesn't give these purveyors enough money to do these massive projects. This also means that their water purveyors, because they're trying to balance the needs of many different types of water users, they're having to think about how to balance allocations of water for agricultural use. Right now, agricultural users consume about 55% of all water use, but there's a lot of tension in how that water is allocated as our population grows. The figure on the right shows that the population, particularly in central Okanagan, is increasing really dramatically. And in fact, the Okanagan Valley itself has the highest population growth in the whole country. There are a lot of people moving here, and a lot of them want to use water. So water purveyors have to balance how to apply drought restrictions. Do they apply that to domestic water users, or do they apply that to agricultural users, which are using a lot of the water and there are fewer of them? And that's causing significant anxiety. And the other big issue, which I wanted to mention, is regarding irrigation on and off dates. So each of these 50 or so water purveyors allocate or designate different days when agricultural irrigators can start to turn on their water systems in the spring and when they can turn them off again in the fall. And these are really variable. Some water purveyors will give on dates in mid-April, and others ask for growers to wait until late May. And then they're given access to water until between mid-September or as late as mid-October. So there's a huge amount of variability from water purveyor to water purveyor. And as our growing seasons get longer and we get these increasing climate extremes, growers are getting really kind of stuck in the middle sometimes, where the need for water doesn't match these on-off dates. And so there's a growing call to kind of reevaluate how those on-off dates are considered and decided. So what are growers in the Okanagan Valley doing to accommodate all this increasing demand and challenges to the systems on which they rely to supply their water. The first, and Alan brought this up, is installing efficient and well-engineered systems, making sure that the irrigation systems you've got in place can supply the water you need. You've got enough irrigation zones, they accommodate the slopes and the soil types, and they deliver the water in an efficient way. And really, most producers that answered the survey, and most producers in the Okanagan Valley use under-tree micro sprinklers or drip emitters to deliver that water in a really efficient way. And then there's a need to match your water supply to your demand. And again, like Ellen mentioned, and like was raised in the survey, there's lots of different ways to do that. Different growers use different systems, whether it's on-site weather stations or the use of weather network data to estimate evapotranspiration, for example, and help you schedule your irrigation. And then monitoring the effect of that irrigation on soil moisture, or as Alan rightly said, really what matters is the tree. So keeping track of how your irrigation affects your soil moisture. Is it going up through time? Is it going down? And the trees that you're watering, and especially in response to extreme events that come and go through time. But there are other practices that you can try. Alan mentioned a couple. One that we have explored quite a bit here at the Summerlin Research Station is the use of organic surface mulches. And the figure that you see on this slide is actually taken from a vineyard, but it illustrates something that we've seen in a lot of our research trials on orchards, that having a surface layer of organic material can really buffer trees from water deficits, emergency drought restrictions, sudden application of deficit irrigation for a variety of reasons. So that surface organic material can really be helpful. And the figure on the left that you see there is from a trial we just established a couple of years ago. So I didn't want to share the data because it's still quite preliminary, but we are trying to compare the amount of water that's required to maintain certain moisture content with and without the surface mulches. And we're finding that really these surface mulches might be capable of reducing our water requirements by up to 50%. So hopefully over the next few years, we'll see if we can be confident in those numbers, and we'll be able to share them. Another thing that's really key, and events like this and work of extension officers really plays an important role, is communication. I work a lot with farmers and learn so much from farmers, and I know that farmers really trust each other and learn from each other, and look to those extension experts as well to share ideas for how to adapt or new things to try. We don't have the same kind of land grant universities and extension program that you have in the States, and we often complain about that. But fortunately, the province is getting back into the extension game, which is why we have people like Lindsay and Caitlin here to help us. And a lot of different agencies are also involved in developing video series and workshops and case studies to help farmers here in the Valley improve their confidence and their efficiency and effectiveness of irrigation. But I think in our case, where we have this water user and water purveyor relationship, that is something where we could really benefit by active communication between agricultural water users and water purveyors who are making decisions about water allocations and water restrictions. And one example for this is taken from a paper just published earlier in the year by a PhD student, Elizabeth Houghton, who worked with 5 commercial sweet cherry producers across the Okanagan Valley to see how post-harvest reductions in irrigation volumes would affect the yield and food quality in the subsequent year. And you can see from this figure that really, she found no effect of reducing the amount of water by 30% or 50% on the yield or the fruit quality in the subsequent year. On one site, in 1 year at site 4, reducing the water prior or after harvest in 2019 actually increased the yield of sweet cherries on that one site, but otherwise we found absolutely no treatment effect. So having this information in our back pocket and communicating with water purveyors might help us better work with them to decide, okay, which commodity might be able to spare water right now to benefit somebody else. And that's going to really vary from year to year, depending on when the drought restrictions need to be imposed. And the last thing that I think a lot of farmers are contemplating is just really being prepared to adapt. If there's anything I've heard from growers is every year is wacky now. There's no real average. And so having a whole bunch of tools in that toolkit to help growers know, okay, this is what I'm facing this year. This is what I can do is really, really helpful. That's where extension services come in and talking to each other come in. But getting ready and armed to know how to adapt is super useful. I know a lot of growers are thinking about diversifying their crops and their varieties or even the locations of where they're growing, considering other methods of crop pooling that don't rely on water, such as shade cloth or foliar spray, and also being able to adapt in those real emergencies. If suddenly a drought restriction is put in place and access to water is reduced, maybe dropping your crop load. In some cases for apples, for example, once we're in cell expansion mode, dropping that crop load in apples seems to be able to help protect the quality of the remaining crop, for example. And sometimes irrigation decision-making on the fly is really necessary. Here's a quick example that we saw during the heat dome of 2021. You can see that figure on the top left shows it's really shriveled cherries. This is from, embarrassingly, a block of my own, where we had really warm temperatures come on in late June, and we were scheduling irrigation to replace evapotranspiration, and yet the leaves were drooping and the cherries were shriveling, and we just didn't know what to do. And when we looked at our soil moisture sensors, we got data that looked like the figure on the bottom left. That orange panel shows the air, shows the heat dome period, and the air temperature really spiked. And during that period, the soil moisture also went up. And we were really surprised by this. We thought that the trees would be pumping through that water like crazy. And when I mentioned this to Jerry and Denise Nielsen and Tom Forge, predecessors here at the research center, they passed along some data to me from an unpublished greenhouse study they had done looking at the effect of air temperature on sap flow in greenhouse grown stardust cherries. And they found that above 35 degrees Celsius with 95 Fahrenheit, even when the trees were well watered, the stomates were closing, which meant that in my case, pumping all that irrigation water onto the trees was really just a waste and was making them sit in really soggy, wet soil. So being observant and learning to adjust in weird, unforeseen circumstances seems to be the name of the day. So just to summarize, irrigation is absolutely necessary for agriculture here in the valley, but anywhere it can support resilience to extreme drought conditions. And here in the Okanagan Valley, what I'm hearing from growers is that there are 3 key points that they're really trying to keep in mind. Careful water management, which we all know is important, but also that active communication with each other and with those that supply the water to us, and getting ready to adapt at a moment's notice when we're hit with the next weird thing. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kirsten, for depressing us all. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. That brought a really good reality touch to why we're having this discussion and what's bringing on. So in the sake of time, I'm hoping all our friends here on the East Coast brush their teeth and are in their jammies listening to this so you can get cozy and be part of the discussion. I wanted to jump to our panel to kind of introduce each of them, what their situation is, so what they can bring to the discussion with that, and then we can open up the floor for questions to the speakers and the panelists. So if I can jump, I'm just going to randomly pick on people. Steve Frecon, is he on here? I know he had an interesting story when we started this whole discussion of, I think you've had all the extremes of water to deal with. So I'll let you quickly give an introduction of what your situation.
Yeah, I am, and I'll turn my camera on because I'd rather look at the orchard, and I think you guys would too, than look at my face. So I just want to point out how important this subject is, because according to the local news, I'm supposed to limit my exposure to the outdoors today, and I'm out here today just so everyone could see what we deal with in Pennsylvania. But risking your life to run an orchard is just a daily occurrence, and it's what we got to do. So anyhow. But so I'm Steve Frecon. I'm from Boyertown, Pennsylvania. We're about an hour northwest of Philadelphia. We go through extreme dries and extreme lows here, or extreme wet periods, which is what we're in now. When we started this conversation, we were in one of our very extreme dry periods. What I'm looking at over here, just to point out, is some trees that were planted just this spring. And they got about 2 inches of rain right after they were planted, and then experienced probably 30 to 40 days without any rain at all before we got the irrigation on them. And they're still recovering from the stress of that drought period, even though in the past 2 weeks, we've had over 3 inches of rain and are at a point where we're actually disposing of peaches on the ground because they're getting a soggy condition from too much rain too fast. So, one of the reasons I picked this spot of the orchard to take this Zoom call from, one of the things that we talked about in dealing with extreme water conditions is our terrain. I don't know, I hope this kind of comes through. You can see the slope of our hills here, but we actually plant our trellises on berms because we get these deluges of water that take out our row middles. So I don't know if this is coming through or not, but I tried to pick the highest elevation of one of our trellises that goes down these slopes to show how we put the apples here or the trees up on a high berm with the drip line that was just installed this year, because we're finding that we absolutely need to now start having irrigation where we in the past did not have it, because we go through these extreme periods of no water for a long time and then too much water. So we've got a double factor going on here. One piece is changing the landscape of the orchard to maintain our drive rows when we actually do get water, because it comes so much all at once that it takes out the soil and the erosion on the steep hillside that we grow on. And then the other factor is that because we're planting on a berm and because we can go through these extreme periods in the springtime with no rain, we do need the trickle irrigation to keep the trees surviving. So I'm still learning about this and how to manage it. And one of the things that I'm really interested in figuring out is when to water and when to turn the water off.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, when we started the conversation, Steve told us about who was paying to truck in the water to his orchard. So that just blew my mind. I thought we had it bad in the Okanagan. So I guess I'm see Kyle's videos jumping around here, so I'm going to pick on him next.
Yeah, well, before this started, I mentioned that if it started raining, I would go outside in order to make it rain, and so it seemed to do that. So we are getting downpour right now. We have been, I'm Kyle Rasch. I'm from Michigan, just east of the ridge. And yeah, sandy loam, 1 to 4% organic matter, depending on where you're at. But we've been without water for pushing nearly 2 months now. So we had an inch of rain, the first inch here a couple of days ago, and we are just finally getting another downpour. So this is really exciting. Yeah. So
Kyle, you're gonna have to share your rain dance with the rest of us later on of what you did to rain on the rain.
I have to switch to my waterproof phone here because this iPad may not like it. I don't know.
All right, then in that case, we'll jump to Steve Brown next here then. We'll let you switch up.
Yeah, hey guys, my name's Steve Brown. I live fairly close to Lindsay, actually. So I live in Summerland, British Columbia, Canada. And in that great presentation earlier, as you probably saw, like the Okanagan Valley is definitely a desert for sure. So having said that, we've had some pretty weird weather the last little while. We've had some pretty massive deluges as well, and some downpours and stuff, and had some major flooding as well. And we have a massive water body. We have one of the big lakes where we're close to, the Okanagan Lake, actually flooded very significantly not too many years ago, and wiped out lots of lakefront homes and docks and all that stuff. So we're definitely dealing with pretty wide ranges. But I would say in large part, in most common years, irrigation is an issue because we didn't have it. We would not be able to grow anything. It'd just be sagebrush. So it's definitely a desert here. So yeah, anyway, it's an introduction, I guess. We can
Thanks,
talk about
Steve.
more stuff a little later.
Sure, and I see Tom turned on his video, so I'll jump over to Tom Ferri in Ontario.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we're in Ontario in the most northerly apple growing district, and that's in the Georgian Bay region, about 2 hours north of Toronto. This farm is a clay loam, so it does hold the water well, but we have everything under trickle irrigation. And we've been going through ups and downs for sure. We had about 3/4 of an inch of rain this week, and maybe an inch about 2 to 3 weeks ago. But prior to that, we were about a good month with nothing. So it's eased up a little bit of the irrigating the last 10 days or so. Our big thing is the swings, like the other gentleman said, it's a feast or a famine, really. This location is I grew up on a sand farm. In this location, we bought it about 20 years ago and redid the whole property, and it's a clay loam. So this has been a learning experience for me for sure, between sand and this. But sometimes I wish we were still on the sand, but then there's other times this isn't too bad once you've gotten used to it. That's it in a nutshell right now.
It's too bad you can't mix those two soils together. Yeah. All right, and then our last grower panelist we have here tonight is Garret from Washington.
Yeah, sorry about that. I can't seem to get the video to work, but yeah, Garret Henry. I work with Douglas Fruit. We farm in the Columbia Basin, and our water comes from the Columbia River as part of the Columbia Basin Irrigation Project, which was started in 1948 and covered about 5,000 acres, and now it's around 671,000 acres. And we don't really have an issue with it because of the Columbia River. So we use as far as irrigation, of course we have to irrigate because we get less than 8 inches of water here a year. So we are a desert, and so we use drip, we use micro sprinklers, we use overhead cooling, and we also use sprinklers for frost control. Mostly we use drip to avoid fire blight conditions and for fertigation.
This is great. We're going to come to you with lots of questions. And I like Steve's question. He said, "You're welcome, Garret, for sending the water down your way. We won't turn off the river." So on that note, thank you guys so much. I do want to open the floor now. Was there any questions with the speakers? And of course, that also opens up to any of our panelists from anybody joining us in right now. There was a question I noticed in the chat back when Alan was speaking. And I'm not sure, Jessica, did you want to speak up and give your question, or do you want me to throw it out here for the group?
I can speak up.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, I just was curious. I'm familiar with using pressure chambers with grapevines. And for the group's background, I predominantly work in viticulture, so apples are kind of new to me. Is it the same kind of metrics for stress with leaf water potential readings with grapevines as with apples, or is it different? Because I'm used to like -10 to -12 bars being like mild stress, -12 to 14 being moderate, and -14 to -16 being pretty high stress.
Okay, maybe I can take that. Apples generally would be several bars lower in each of those cases, maybe 4 or 5 bars lower. The one difference is that grapevines don't really adapt, so those numbers stay pretty much the same all season long. But apples have the ability to accumulate a lot of sugars in their leaves, so it's called osmotic adjustment, so that it can keep some turgor in the leaves with more stress. And so sometimes when if it's minus 15 or 20 bars later in the season, if it's been dry, the apple might adjust so that the leaves can be just as functional at 30 bars. So it's a bit more variable to say the numbers for apple, but if there hasn't been a lot of stress, then usually the apples are 4 or 5 bars lower in each category.
Just a follow-up question, do you have a bar reading that you would initiate irrigation at?
It depends on whether you're trying to maintain just a maximum water status. I'd say probably maybe minus 15 bars. You're talking about exposed leaves, water potential.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks for the question.
Okay, thanks.
I was going to start hearing the results of the poll and kind of what everybody's experiences are. It sounds like irrigation, the needs for water, needs to control when you're putting the water on is the biggest issue, I'd say universally across the board is what I'm hearing with this. And so maybe jumping to when we had some discussions around even with too much water, too little water, there was kind of some management decisions. So the water affected the decisions of what to grow when and that irrigation system you choose to put in. So I guess I would throw out the question to our panelists or our speakers. What are the decisions or what are the factors you look at when you're deciding what type of irrigation system to go with, or what's helping you decide which monitoring system to go with? Feel free to jump in, anyone, or else I'm going to start picking on people.
I mean, I can jump in if you want. I mean, I think soil type is probably one of the biggest factors, right? With design. And so, for example, if you have sand, that you may want like to use micro sprinklers, especially on the root system to go out further, or have to use multiple runs of irrigation, as opposed to like a heavy silt or clay, in which case you get much more capillary action, and it's going to, your soil profile is going to stay more at field capacity for longer. Interesting aside, actually, Lindsay, if I may, on that. I mean, most experiments on the farm happen by accident, and this was no different. So a little story for you. Some of you may be familiar with ambrosia apples. We've got a lot of those in Canada, sort of where they originated from. And so I worked as a fieldman for years for BC Treaters Co-op. But anyway, one year I was up at a particular grower's farm that I was consulting for, and we noticed that there was a massive difference between the size of his ambrosia, and it happened to be that one. And he had actually a cherry orchard above this. It was on a fairly steep slope, but he had a cherry orchard above, and then sort of lower he had an ambrosia block. And it just so happened that they had pulled down some of the cherry drip lines and just thrown them into the apple row below, but hadn't disconnected them. And so this one row was getting double the water that all the other ambrosia apple rows were getting. And surprise, surprise, the apples were way bigger And so it just sort of showed he had a fairly coarse soil at that particular location, but just sort of showed like, wow, these trees actually needed a lot more water than when you're watering them if you want to maximize your size. And obviously, just as an aside as well, ambrosia specifically they're a princess as far as being really sensitive to not only water but also nutrients and all that stuff as well. But it was a really interesting, just accidental experiment, because that particular grower thought that he was putting on more than enough water, and so did I actually, because I think I even asked him at one point, and I based on my sort of rough calculations, I thought he was too, but it ended up he needed more water. And maybe it was also the fact too that had some drip lines were going down the bottom, and they put a couple of drip lines, sort of stacked them up top as well, that covered over those roots. So interesting little side.
So do you think part of that, so the drip systems, I mean, we know they work great in grapes because grapes also have more of a taproot system that goes straight down. Trees like to spread out. Have many people on this call, have they had to switch up the irrigation systems? I guess looking at that, I mean, our focus used to be on reducing water use. Now we're looking at different rootstock. Some people are starting to go to bigger rootstock systems with these multi-liter systems. Are some of these things starting to change for people? Or are you finding your irrigation system is fine, or are there things you wish you'd done better and you're switching up to?
Well, we had quite a few. This is Garret. We've had some systems where we went to solely drip irrigation, and especially on things like cherries, even apples. We found that we really struggle with fruit size, just trying to maintain, and it's not just you can maintain an area, but like you're saying, the root systems are growing out, right? So you need to actually maintain a water pattern in a bigger area in order to size that crop. That's what we found. So we actually went back into several blocks and added sprinklers back in. And so that's where we mainly use the drip for fertigation or for early season when we're trying to keep, there's maybe not as much water usage, but we're trying to avoid, powdery mildew in cherries or like I said, fire blight in apples. So yeah, we've kind of gone from drip back to sprinklers.
So when you say sprinklers, Garret, are you doing a dual system where you've got drip and you've got micro sprinklers, or are you implementing you said you had some overhead cooling plus frost protection with your irrigation systems?
Yeah, so we have like in cherries we'll run double drip and then under tree sprinklers, and then in apples a lot of times we'll just run a single drip, under tree micro sprinklers, and then we'll also have overhead. There's basically like 3 separate systems in the block.
Wow. Any other people with comments?
I would just second what you said earlier about using it as a tool for different rootstocks. So all of our high density uses often either micro sprinklers or drip, but all of our larger plantings kind of are more towards the drip side, but using double lines of drip on larger trees. Just is a bit difficult to get micro sprinklers to cover our 18-foot old ancient trees out here. So, but we're also transitioning from using some large traveling guns, so massive orchard sprinklers that kind of pull themselves through the orchard and do all of our overhead that way. So transitioning from that to drip can be a bit shocking to that system. So we ease into that a bit. Sorry, I just got done doing my rain dance, so it's soaked.
So now with some of the growers on this call then, that before you never had to worry about irrigation systems, you kind of got what you needed when you needed, and you're finding these are going to further extremes now. Are you finding you're having to adapt the trees the way Kyle's talking? So or when you get the right system in place, you're finding everything's all right? I don't know if I asked that right.
We find that on this property, because of this clay loam, we've got drip irrigation, and it's emitters every 2 feet with half a gallon an hour, I believe, and they it seems to be fine. On our old farm, sand, like we were doubling up lines in places, and certainly a lot longer run times. But this soil is a lot better water holding capacity. So what we've done here, and it's all M9 planted super high densities of 2,500 and 3,000 trees the acre, but we can keep up quite easily. It sure is nice if it rains, but we can keep up with the amount of water. We dug a big pond here and we can fill it from a well. So it's worked out well here, touch wood, so far. And we've had some pretty dry extremes, but it's mainly due to the soil. I think it's a very high organic matter too. I never seen anything like this till we moved here. It's between 5 and 7%. So I think it's old lake bottom. Lots of Georgian bay potatoes, so there's some rocks too.
Well, that is some envious organic matter to us in BC for sure.
Well, we were dealing with 2% where we were before. So yeah.
I see Steve Frecon got his camera on. Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
I was just going to say, for us, our orchard, it's heavy clay soils, and we have portions of the orchard where we actually have to tile drain them, because it's just, even in the middle of what seems to be like a 20-day period with no rain, we still have standing water. And you'll see that, leaf growth on the trees is almost stunted from too much water. So on that side of the orchard, we're planting things on berms and tile, try to get the water away from the trees. And I think that's especially as we modify the orchard and move away from older freestanding trees that are much more suited to dealing with changing extremes of too much water and then not enough water. As we try to move into higher and higher density plantings, those water extremes have a much more immediate impact on the tree. And just in the acreage that we're dealing with, as we move from the varying changes from one side of the orchard to another and trying to figure out is when is there too much water? When should there be less water? Adding it, taking it away, that seems to be our new challenge that we're trying to figure out our way through, because our soil does hold a lot of water when it's there, and it holds it for a long time. And I think that's going to be the tough thing for us to figure out as we go forward, is there's going to be some sites that need a lot less water than other sites.
So with that, what I'm hearing and kind of going back to Alan's talk, with some of these ways that we do monitor for moisture levels, we can check the soil, we got sap flow, we've got the visuals of actually looking at the growth of the tree. And what I'm hearing from all the growers on the panels here is everybody's using all of those tools. And it doesn't sound like we could ever rely on just one of those tools. But we see with a lot of technology moving to more remote systems where people are monitoring their systems remotely and making decisions to try and balance or manage more acreage. I'd be curious to know tips and advice from everybody of lessons learned. Garret, you've probably got a lot of experience with this one of how do you balance that monitoring of moisture with all these different tools in terms of so the soil moisture, we know you can't just have it one spot. Like it sounded in Steve's example, maybe the grower had a soil moisture probe right in the line where the drip was, so it showed like everything was great for those trees, but meanwhile the roots were growing past that system. What is your best tools, I guess, or how do you guys balance these decisions that you need to make, and what is the technology you wish you had in your pocket?
Well, my advice would be trust nothing. All of our ranch managers and most of our irrigators carry a soil probe, and we use moisture monitoring programs, and we have a consultant comes out and does gravimetrical sampling in some of our Honeycrisp blocks, because we really try to dial those in. But to give an example, one of the ranch managers a couple of years ago, when we started putting in these soil moisture monitors, really relied on them, and he really liked them. And I drove by the block one day and it looked really dry. And I went out there and started probing it. And I was calling him up, like, what are we doing? And he's got the program up. He goes, look, it's 80-some% soil moisture. Well, my friend, you need to come out and we need to look at this. And so it was a valuable lesson. And it was something that, we kind of we talk about at meetings, and it's hard to replace getting out and actually sampling yourself, because all those are great tools, but they're single point source, and you have some variability, or if it's, you know, for one reason or other. And also on another ranch, a lot of times our irrigator, who's very good, we'll call up the Will Borellis who manages the probes and say, hey, you need to come back out and recalibrate these probes. They're not reading right. So the guy will come back out and recalibrate them. And that's the other thing about these the probes we've worked with, is they generally need to be recalibrated during the season. So just be careful. That'd be my advice for remote management.
Yeah, I can echo most of that. We use probes as well, and trusting a probe sometimes does get you in trouble. So we also back that with boots on the ground, whether that be shovels or mobile moisture probes. But yeah, really just getting your hands in the soil and seeing what's actually going on under the tree seems to be often quite illuminating when you think you're getting water to the whole tree root, and maybe it's like
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, one thing I would add is a couple of our ranches last year went to these high-powered battery drills with an auger, and so it made it a lot simpler to check more sites in the day. So, you know, I still have the old push probe, but you know, if you've got tougher ground, they really, I mean, they're kind of expensive, but I think you make your money back on them.
With that comment, I hope you don't mind one of the hosts jumping in here. This is Daniel. I've done some work with some of these soil probes with Dr. Longhee at Penn State. And if you've never seen one, this is basically what one of them looks like. It's a 3-prong system, has a long coaxial cable attached to it, and you've got to bury these things. We bury them at 3 feet deep, 2 feet, and 1 feet. And the reason I wanted to jump in here was, and Garret kind of hit on this when he was talking about using an auger, we had a terrible time burying these things. So if you're thinking about using this, pay attention to what is in your soil, less about the soil type and more about whether or not it is nothing but rocks. We had 4 different locations where we were putting these in, and it literally took us 2 whole days to put 1 unit in, because we started off with just a shovel, which I knew wasn't going to work to begin with. Then we tried one of those fence post diggers, you know, pound it in, pull, and so on, and you get about 1 centimeter's worth of soil out with that. We then ended up going to a rental center and getting an auger. The problem was we burnt out the auger because it could not get through all the rocks. So this is, yeah, Steve says, sounds like you need a backhoe. Yeah, that's actually pretty true. And that's sort of what we ended up having to do, because we did end up having to pay for the auger. And I felt really sorry for the grad student that was working on this thing, because he's holding on it and it's just literally bouncing up and down. It was like watching a little kid on a pogo stick, except the guy was about 7 feet tall. So anyway, the whole point of telling that goofy story is, when you're thinking about what kind of soil moisture monitoring you want to do, you've got to take stuff like that into consideration. And it's not something that really clicked with either of us, because unfortunately, Long and I were both new to Penn State and new to Pennsylvania. And where I grew up, we had 3 feet of beautiful black rich soil, and he did all his postdoc work out of Washington. So neither of us were expecting this. You actually have orchards, you know what your soil type is. So just keep that in mind. You got to get these things into the ground. I'll turn it back over to the panelists, because nobody wants to hear me.
I want to know how they got the trees in the ground now.
Yeah.
On that
talk
line,
to Steve Frecon about that.
There we go. I was gonna say, kind of going along this lines then of decisions made. So now we know we can monitor. Is there things people are implementing as well to also maintain that water? Like Steve talked about using the berms now to try and help direct water, using tile drainage to manage that. But there is this idea of cover crops is becoming quite popular in BC. And something the heat dome certainly taught us is that grass is actually kind of important, or whatever the mix is that you have between it, that actually regulated the temperatures as well, so that the water being used to that. I heard Garret talk about fertigation being part of why he has the dual system and where you're trying to put it. I think Kyle had some comments dealing with fertigation as well. So I'd be curious, some of these other things we need to think about when we look at the whole system in an orchard are important decisions with you when you guys are looking at your water use. So things like cover crop, getting your nutrients into the ground and the root zones. What are some of those things that you're considering and working with your irrigation systems?
Yeah, I guess I can go for name dropped me. We do use, so we're on our way to being certifying our whole farm organic and eliminated herbicide on almost all the farm. And so most everything we're doing is working with a living soil. That can look like new plantings all get wood chip mulch. So that's how we alleviate some of the weed pressure early on. And also that alleviates a lot of the moisture inconsistencies, as you've seen with the previous speaker. So I think that's pretty critical to the only way we're really able to get some of those, especially with rodent damage as well. That's wood chips are really critical to that early age tree. And then as they get older, we're doing more mow and blow techniques. So whatever we grow in the alleyway, we're then blowing that underneath the tree. And yeah, we're of course playing with a lot of soil amendments as well. So whether that's to increase carbon or organic matter or microbial stimulants and all sorts of other things. Being organic, it looks pretty weird when we start mixing things into our drip lines. So
well, and
yeah.
you had a really good point in our previous discussions leading up to this, that I mean, we often talk about getting the water to the tree, but then if your system is using dried fertilizers and spreading it out on the ground, but you don't get the rains anymore to wash that fertilizer down into the soil systems that it used to, you're basically throwing away the fertilizer. And so, yeah, Garret, you'd made a comment that you have these dual systems so that you can control when you're doing your fertigation through one, but you're not necessarily throwing it out, I'm guessing, to the rest of the orchard where the roots aren't.
Are you talking about just fertilizer in general?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, so we do both. I mean, we do some broadcast or some banding in basically in our weed strip, on our kill strip area there. So we do that. And then we also run some, and we also fertigate some. So we do both because yeah, I'm kind of a proponent of getting fertilizer spread in that area where we think all the roots are versus just right in this one little zone. So we just.
Oh, I'm not sure if Garrett's trying to talk and it got cut off there. Oh, thanks. Sorry about that. And just for the sake of time, I was just going to try and keep this moving a little bit faster. Sorry. There's so much, this is such a great topic and there's so much we could go into with water. I wish we had the whole evening, but like I said, I can appreciate it's much later out in the East Coast than it is for us here on the West. So with that being said, Garret, you had mentioned other uses of water, like you're doing frost protection as well as cooling systems with water. Listening to what Dr. Hannam was talking about with the issues we have in BC of where does water go? Where's the priority for waters now when we're dealing with agriculture systems versus just the human consumption? Do you see much impact, or does that play a role in the irrigation and when you can do your irrigating, that you're using it as well for these other purposes?
Well, when we start overhead cooling, then yeah, we will reduce our under tree sprinklers because we're just watching soil moisture. So a lot of times once we start overhead cooling, we don't irrigate as much for sure. So it does impact it. It does impact our our under tree system.
I'd be curious to know from the speakers, we have the researchers too, does overhead cooling reduce the need for irrigation then? Like if we're talking about how this air temperature makes a difference.
I might make a comment. Yeah, it would. It certainly at the time it's there and after as it's evaporating, it'll certainly reduce the evaporative demand, and the water that would normally be pulled out of the leaves by that dry air is actually being supplied by the free water on the surface. So yeah, you would expect to see an improvement. I guess the issue would be after it evaporates, and then the wind just moves around big structures like trees very easily, so it wouldn't really be kept in the orchard for very long. So I guess the question is, you improve the water status, and then after it evaporates, it's going to start going down again. Actually, I don't know if Lee Calcitz, I don't know if Lee's on this call or not. He's doing work. He was monitoring these sorts of issues with during the super hot periods that it had over the last couple of years. And so he may have some answers. I've seen some data where he did some midday, when it started getting really hot about 10 or 11 in the morning, putting on an extra irrigation dose to try to relieve that stress in the middle of the day. And I think he had some pretty good results on that. But I don't know, maybe Bernardita knows about those results.
Yes, so beside those that Lee's working, I see here in the call, and I don't know if Basabarashi is available to speak about it, but we've been evaluating the different mitigation heat mitigation practices here in Washington using netting, a fogging system which uses a reduced amount of water compared to overhead cooling. Definitely the overhead cooling does increase the moisture in the soils. And so this is something that in Washington, at least in high value apples, we want to prevent. So we don't have that high vigor and more incidence of bitter pit, for example. So we are trying to manage the water in those big apples or high value apples that require more controlling the vigor. And I'm trying to see if Basabarashi is available to share a little bit of what we've learned in that trial in relation to the overhead cooling and the use of water.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry
Yes.
to put you in the spot.
Okay. No, I didn't know that this question would come. Okay, so I'm still a student. I do PhD in here with Dr. Lakso. So I'm doing the trials that Bernardita just explained. Like we are evaluating how the foggers, netting, or overhead cooling will actually decrease the heat stress on apples. But while doing that, we observed that we get higher soil moisture content when we use overhead sprinklers, and we get a good fruit size, like maybe more vigor, more fruit size, like bigger fruits. But under the fogging, what we were observing is the soil moisture is not actually increasing, because the foggers are, there are two things that probably happening under the fogging. One thing is there is no grass that is, or cover crop that is coming up between the rows, which in overhead cooling, we have the grass or the cover crop in between the rows because of continuous sprinklers. So that is the one thing that maybe making the less soil moisture in fogging and more soil moisture continuously in overhead sprinklers. Then in fogging, the other thing might be like the water is not actually reaching the soil. It is just evaporating before it reaches the soil or any plant surface underneath the fogging. So the trees under the fogging, we measured the stem water potential in the afternoon on few of the hottest days. And in the fogging, we were seeing around 13 and 14 bars like in the fogging, and just 6-5 under the overhead sprinklers. So it was around half in the overhead sprinklers, the stem water potential. So the trees were stressed in a way under the fogging, but not under the sprinklers. And also we had the soil moisture sensors, like the different one from Campbell, which were volumetric soil sensors, so which gives like just volume of water in the soil. And it was pretty high in the more than required under the overhead sprinklers, but fogging was really dry. Like,
That is a great segue for if the story of, I don't want to cut off this discussion, but I'm afraid with time, I probably should bring this down. This is a great segue though, like I say, because the next topic is heat. And we actually are going to have Lee Kelsit as one of the speakers at that discussion for that webinar. So absolutely, I can only cut off this conversation knowing that hopefully this means we're going to continue it at the next webinar. So I really look forward to this. And I love this discussion to wind it up at the end, that irrigation is not just a drip line or the water directly going into the soil that we need to think about. It is the whole picture that cover crop plays a difference in terms of the air temperature plays a difference, and how we look at it, that maybe overhead sprinklers isn't a waste of water if it's actually reducing how much water we need to put down underneath that tree canopy. So great discussion. I want to thank again the speakers and the panelists for their time and energy putting into bringing all your experiences. Thank you. I feel so weird in these things. I feel I want to clap for everybody. But I am going to turn this over to Daniel now to bring back on the slideshow so that we can direct everybody with what's next. And of course, we always want to hear the feedback from you guys. I love this format and I would love to see it continue, and we'd love to hear what topics are meaningful for growers across this, like a whole continent, I could say, across the continent. What do growers want to hear from us, and what sort of topics would be best to tackle next? So you'll see that there is a link or a nice QR code up on the screen there. And Daniel, I'm just going to hand it over to you to do the tech talk stuff.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, so on the screen here, you see a little survey that we have. We'd appreciate it if you could take just a moment to answer a few questions, and it literally is just a few questions to give us your feedback on the information that's presented tonight and your thoughts on this series. As Lindsay just mentioned, we plan on expanding this next year, having additional topics to cover, perhaps even adding in an additional region, but we need your feedback on what you want us to talk about. Each of us has a research priorities list that we've got from our various institutions. We've got growers in our areas that we talk to, but we can't always synthesize what everybody wants to know about whatever the current hot topic is. So if you could reach out to us or enter some ideas into the chat, we'll leave the chat open for a little bit here about what you'd like to hear next time. That's great. That's for next year. We do have one more this year, and it's on July 13th. You can use the same URL you used to get here. It's not going to be any different. So you made it on tonight, you can make it on the 13th. And so we hope to see you then. We'll have a great panel. A lot of the panelists that we have here tonight will be back again to talk about their experiences dealing with heat, and we'll have another pair of good speakers. So I'm going to stop the share now. Actually, I'll back up real quick here so you can see the survey link or get that QR code again. And I'll flip it back over to you, Lindsay.
I don't think there's much more for me to say. Thank you all for coming tonight and hanging in here to the end. I appreciate us. You let us run a bit late with this, and I look forward to the discussion at the heat. Appropriately that we're having the heat session right in the middle of July.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you being here tonight.
100%.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.